The wind was sharp that evening, tearing down through the pine ridges like it had a purpose of its own, carrying with it the bite of snow. The tall man trudging through the forest leaned against the weight of it, his broad shoulders hunched, his wool coat stiff with ice. He had been working lumber since before the sun came up, and though he had learned to respect the cold seasons of the American frontier, this night pressed deeper than usual. His boots sank into the crusted snow, each step heavy, as though the earth itself wanted to hold him down. He had no lantern, only the dim light of the winter moon slipping between clouds. Out there in the wilderness, far from any town or warm hearth, survival often meant trusting instincts more than sight. And his instincts told him one thing: he needed shelter before the storm grew worse. The forest had always been both friend and enemy to a man like him, gave him work, timber that he could shape and sell, but it also tested him without mercy. Lone in those woods, every sound carried meaning. The creak of branches could signal a falling tree, the snap of a twig could mean a wolf too close for comfort, the roll of wind could be hiding a storm on the rise. He had grown used to such company. Solitude was the lumberjack's closest companion, silence his truest ally. Yet as he pressed deeper into the dark timberland, searching for a place to lay his head, there was a feeling he couldn't shake. The night seemed to carry more than cold. It carried presence. The path curved into a gorge where rock rose up on both sides, jagged edges catching flakes of snow. He followed it down, hoping the stone walls would give him some break from the howling wind. That was when he spotted the opening. It yawned wide in the face of the cliff, shadowed but unmistakable. A cave, a natural shelter. Relief swept over him for the first time since leaving the camp. The mountains rarely gave gifts, but when they did, a man learned to take them without question. Adjusting the axe slung across his back, he started toward it, careful over the icy stones, his breath puffing in great clouds against the night. Inside, the air was warmer, or at least it felt so after the sting of the outside world. His boots echoed faintly as he stepped across the uneven ground. The cave was not large, but deep enough to keep a man hidden from the storm. He ran his rough hand across the wall, the rock cool and steady beneath his touch. For a moment, he let out a long breath, settling his shoulders, imagining how good it would feel to rest. The storm could rage all it wanted out there. Tonight, he had found his place. Or so he thought. A sound came then, faint, almost like a shuffle of fabric against stone. He froze, every muscle hardening the way a hunter stiffens when something unseen stirs nearby. His eyes searched the shadows. At first he thought it might be an animal, a bear or coyote holed up before him. That wouldn't be the first time a man stumbled upon a beast's den in search of safety. But this sound was different, quieter, deliberate, almost careful. His hand instinctively moved toward his axe, though he didn't yet pull it free. Then came another sound, softer still, the scrape of wood on stone, the slight rustle of dried pine needles shifting. His heart beat harder. He took another step inside, boots pressing against the grit on the floor. That was when a flicker of light broke the dark. A glow, faint but steady, rising from deeper within the cave. Firelight, a flame no animal could make. His breath caught. He wasn't alone. He stood there, looming in the entrance, snow still clinging to his shoulders, unsure whether to announce himself or step back into the cold. But before he could decide, the figure appeared. At first it was only the outline of her, the slender form moving toward him with the glow of fire at her back. The closer she came, the clearer she grew in the dim light. A woman. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, her dress worn but clean, the edges brushed with smoke from the small fire behind her. She was not startled to see him. Instead, her eyes lifted and held his, steady as if she had been expecting someone to walk through that entrance. The lumberjack's chest tightened. A cave in the middle of nowhere, hidden in the rocks, and a widow standing in it, as though she belonged. He knew she was a widow before a word passed between them. Something about the way her eyes carried both strength and sorrow made it clear. There was no ring, no tokens of a man nearby, only her and the flame she had tended. Yet the silence between them felt louder than the storm outside. "You found my shelter," she said at last, her voice even neither welcoming nor hostile. Her words struck him like a hammer. My shelter. The cave wasn't empty ground after all. It belonged to her. He took in the details then, noticing the little things that confirmed it. A pile of wood stacked neatly near the wall, a bed of furs spread close to the fire, a pot resting beside embers, where a meal might have been cooking not long ago. This was not a temporary refuge stumbled upon by chance. This was a home, humble but lived in. The lumberjack shifted his weight, the snow dripping from his coat, forming dark patches on the stone floor. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. His life had taught him to fight for what he needed, to take the woods as they came, to claim survival when and where it offered itself. But he had not expected this. Not a woman. Not here. Certainly not the sharp, unshaken way she watched him, as though measuring his every thought. The silence stretched. Outside, the storm grew louder, snow whistling against the rock face, the forest bowing beneath the weight of it. He knew stepping back into it could mean frostbite before dawn, maybe worse. Yet stepping forward meant trespassing into another soul's guarded space. The cave was hers. But the cold was merciless. He had to choose. The widow did not move, though the firelight behind her flickered, throwing shadows that danced against the walls. There was something in her stillness that unsettled him more than the storm ever could. She did not show fear, but neither did she offer comfort. She was simply there, a mystery carved into the stone itself, waiting to see what he would do. For the first time in many winters, the lumberjack felt uncertain. The axe on his back, the strength in his arms, the hard will that had carried him through storms and hunger, none of it seemed to give him an answer. He was standing at the edge of something he didn't understand, and though the cave promised safety from the night, he could not shake the feeling that entering fully would bind him to more than he bargained for. The fire crackled. Her eyes stayed on him. The storm roared beyond the cave mouth, and the choice hung between them, heavy as the snow pressing down on the trees outside. The man stood at the mouth of the cave, his boots heavy on the stone, his coat dripping melted snow. The storm outside clawed at his back, urging him in, yet the woman's steady gaze held him at the threshold. For a moment he thought about turning away, letting the cold take him, but he knew that would be foolish. He had faced many winters, and he understood the cruelty of a night like this one. The forest would not forgive a man who refused shelter when it was offered. Still, something in her eyes told him this was no simple choice. She did not lower her gaze. The firelight lit one side of her face, leaving the other in shadow. It made her look both fragile and unyielding at the same time. Her hands were folded at her sides, but he sensed she was not defenseless. A woman living alone in the wild did not survive by chance. She must have carried strength beneath that quiet stillness. The lumberjack shifted the axe strap on his shoulder and finally spoke. "I only came to keep from freezing," he said, his voice rough from ours in the cold. "The storm caught me." Her lips tightened just enough to show she had heard him, but no word followed. He wondered if she was weighing his intent, or if she simply wanted him to feel the weight of his intrusion. After a pause, she turned slightly, the hem of her dress brushing the stone as she moved back toward the fire. She neither welcomed him nor told him to leave. She only returned to her place near the flame, her back straight, her head high, as if to say the choice was his to make. He stepped inside. The air of the cave felt warmer already, though it carried the faint scent of smoke, damp rock, and dried pine needles. He kept close to the entrance at first, his eyes sweeping the space again. The fire burned steady in a pit of stones, casting light over the fir bedding and the stacked wood. There were no signs of a man's presence, no boots, no tools, no hat resting on the wall. Only her belongings, neat and spare, the mark of someone who had learned to live with little. She lowered herself onto the furs, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes never straying from the flame. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of burning pine and the low moan of the storm outside. He thought of speaking again, to ask who she was, how she came to live in a cave, but something in her calm restraint kept his questions in his throat. Instead, he knelt near the wall, removed his gloves, and rubbed his hands together for warmth. His mind worked as he sat there, studying her from the corner of his eye. A widow, he was sure of it. Not because she told him, but because her presence carried the weight of loss. There was a loneliness to her, not weak but tempered, like metal forged through fire. He knew that look. Had seen it in others on the frontier, men and women alike who had buried too much and kept walking anyway. She finally spoke again, her voice steady, low but clear. Most men don't find this place. They keep to the paths below. I wasn't looking, he answered. The storm pushed me here. She nodded once, as if that was explanation enough. For a while, they sat in silence. He watched the flames dance over the stones, their shadows painting the cave walls in restless patterns. He thought of the camp he had left behind, the other men likely huddled in their tents, their fires barely holding against the cold. They had chosen to stay together, but he had gone farther, chasing timber deeper into the ridge. Now here he was, sitting across from a stranger whose story he could not guess. The storm outside rose louder, snow hurling itself against the rock face, wind howling like wolves in the night. He knew he would not be leaving before morning. The cave was the only thing standing between him and a death in the drifts. Still, he could not shake the unease. It was not just the strangeness of finding a woman alone in such a place, but the way she held herself, so firm, so unmoved by his presence. He cleared his throat, his voice softer this time. You've lived here long? Her eyes flicked to him, then back to the fire.
Long enough.
The answer gave nothing away. He felt the weight of more words unsaid, but he did not press. She had the air of someone who shared only what she chose and no more. The night deepened, and the cave grew dim, except for the glow of the fire. He shifted his coat, hanging it on a rock to dry. The axe stayed close by his side. She had not asked about it, though she must have noticed. He wondered if she saw it as a threat or simply another tool of survival. Either way, she did not seem unsettled. Time moved slow. The fire popped, sparks leaping and dying in the air. He watched her as she adjusted a log, her hands steady, practiced. This was no passing shelter for her. She had made it into a home, however rough. That meant history. That meant choices, and choices out here always came with a cost. The lumberjack leaned back against the wall, the stone cold through his shirt, his mind turning. Who was she hiding from? Or what had she lost that brought her to a cave high in the ridges? People did not come to the wild for comfort. They came for escape, or because there was nothing left to lose. The thought stirred something in him he had long buried. He too had reasons for walking into these mountains, reasons he rarely spoke aloud. Men in the lumber camps talked of money, of strength, of the pride of taming the wilderness. But beneath those words, each man carried his own shadow. He was no different. Perhaps that was why the woman unsettled him. She was a mirror of what he feared becoming, someone who turned from the world and built a life out of silence. A gust of wind tore through the gorge outside, rattling loose stones from the cliff. The sound echoed through the cave, like distant thunder. He glanced toward the entrance, then back at her. She had not flinched. Her calm was unwavering, as though she had weathered storms greater than this. He studied her more closely now. The firelight showed the lines of her face, fine but marked by endurance. She could not be more than 30, yet there was something older in her expression, a gravity earned by hardship. The dress she wore was plain, patched in places, but clean. She carried no jewelry, no token of a past life, save for a locket that hung faintly visible at her collar. His eyes lingered on it, but he did not ask. Some things were not meant for strangers. The hours dragged on. He dozed in the warmth, only to wake each time the storm shook the rocks above. Each time her figure was there, still and silent by the fire, watching the flames as though they alone kept her tethered. The cave was small, but it felt vast in the silence they shared. A strange tension hung between them, not hostile but thick, like a question waiting without answer. As dawn neared, the fire burned low, and the first pale light seeped through the cave mouth. The storm had not broken, but its fury had eased, leaving a heavy stillness over the forest outside. The lumberjack pushed himself upright, stretching stiff muscles. He looked at her, still seated, her eyes tracing the embers as if in thought. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to thank her for not sending him back into the cold, perhaps to ask about the life that had carved her into who she was. But before he could, she spoke first. "When the storm clears, you'll leave," she said quietly. Her voice carrying a weight that pressed into him more than the snow ever could. He froze, unsure how to answer. There was no anger in her tone, only certainty, as if she already knew the shape of his choice. Her words hung in the air, the fire flickering low, the storm lingering beyond the stone walls. And in that moment, he realized the cave was more than a shelter. It was a boundary. A place where past and present lived side by side, where strangers crossed paths only for a brief and fragile span. Yet something in her eyes told him that leaving might not be as simple as walking out when the sky cleared. The silence returned, heavier now, as though the cave itself was holding its breath. And he understood that whatever had brought her here, whatever had driven her to claim this hollow in the mountain as her home, was something deeper than the snowstorm outside. Something that would not reveal itself easily. The storm had saved him from the cold. But the woman's presence had led him into another kind of wilderness, one no axe or fire could cut through. And he knew, as the dawn crept slowly into the cave, that the true trial had only just begun. The pale light of morning stretched into the cave, revealing rough stone walls that had once seemed protective, but now felt almost confining. The lumberjack had slept only in fragments, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet his mind restless. The woman's words from the night before kept circling in his thoughts. When the storm clears, you'll leave. They were not a request. They were not a warning. They were a truth she believed beyond question. He had survived the night, but something about her certainty pressed at him in ways the cold never could. He sat near the cave mouth, sharpening the edge of his axe with a steady rhythm. The sound echoed faintly, metal against stone, like a heartbeat in the silence. The widow remained near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes set on the coals, though he knew she was aware of him. Everything about her seemed deliberate, even in stillness. He could not decide if she was unafraid of him, or simply past the point of fearing anyone. The storm outside had calmed, but snow lay deep across the ridges, making travel near impossible. He knew it might be days before the mountain paths were passable. The truth was, he could not leave yet, even if he wanted to. Yet admitting that would mean challenging the barrier she had drawn between them. So he remained quiet, biding his time, waiting for a shift that never came. As the day wore on, he studied the cave more closely. Along the far wall, he noticed carvings etched into the rock. They were faint but deliberate lines that formed shapes resembling trees, rivers, maybe even a cabin once standing tall. He touched them when she wasn't looking, tracing the grooves with his fingers. These were not idle marks. They were memories pressed into stone, reminders of a life once lived. He wondered if the widow had carved them, or if they belonged to someone before her. The thoughts stirred questions he dared not voice. Every silence she kept seemed to hold layers of meaning, and he feared tearing through them would awaken something he wasn't prepared to face. Still, his curiosity grew, pressing at him as surely as the hunger gnawed in his stomach. By afternoon, she stirred the fire and set a small pot to boil. Dropping in a handful of dried roots and something he couldn't place, the scent filled the air, earthy and bitter. He watched her hands move with practiced ease, steady and sure. He wanted to thank her, but when he opened his mouth, the words felt too small. She did not cook for him, he realized. She cooked because it was what she did, the rhythm of her life. He was simply there, caught in it for a time. The meal was simple, but it warmed him, spreading heat through his chest in a way that made him forget the storm outside. He caught her eyes once while eating, and for the briefest moment, there was a flicker of something softer, almost human in its warmth, before she looked away. It reminded him that beneath her armor of silence, she was flesh and spirit like anyone else. That glimpse unsettled him more than her stern distance. Later, as the wind died, he heard the faint call of wolves from the timberline. Their howls echoed across the ridges, a reminder that danger lived just beyond the cave. He saw her lift her head at the sound, her jaw tightening, her gaze moving to the cave entrance, as if expecting more than a storm to intrude. He wondered then if she had reason to fear not just the wild beasts, but something else. That night, sleep did not come easily. He lay close to the wall, his axe within reach, the firelight painting shadows that shifted like restless spirits. Across from him, the widow sat upright, her eyes open, watching the flames. She did not sleep. Realized then she might never truly rest. The mountain had marked her too deeply for that. By the second morning, he felt the weight of their unspoken conflict pressing heavier. He had no choice but to remain until the paths cleared, yet she did not soften. Every look, Every word carried the same reminder: he was only passing through. Yet he began to notice small details that gave him more to wonder. She kept a bundle of letters tucked into the fur bedding, tied with string, worn at the edges. Once, when she stepped away to gather wood from the cave's entrance, he caught sight of one unfolded, the ink faded but still legible. He only glimpsed a single line before she returned, but it burned into him. "I will come back when the snows have passed." The words told him everything and nothing all at once. Someone had promised to return, someone who hadn't. He did not ask, but the knowledge sat heavy between them. It explained her claim to the cave, the way she guarded it not only as a home, but as a monument to something lost. As days stretched on, their silence grew into something strange. He began to feel less like an intruder and more like a witness. She moved with purpose, tending fire, boiling roots, stacking wood, as though survival was a language she spoke fluently. He followed her lead in small ways, fetching water from the frozen creek near the gorge, breaking branches for fuel. She did not thank him, yet she did not stop him either. Slowly, he began to sense that she measured worth not by words but by presence. Yet the tension never eased. It only shifted, deeper, more complicated. He found himself wanting to ask questions he knew would wound, about the letters, the carvings, the locket at her collar. But each time, the words caught in his throat. He feared if he asked, the truth would be more than he wanted to know. On the third night, a new sound stirred him awake. Not the storm, not the wolves. It was the sound of footsteps, muffled but unmistakable, crunching in the snow outside the cave. His body tensed, hand gripping the axe before his mind caught up. The widow was already sitting upright, her eyes sharp, fixed on the entrance. They waited in silence, breath held, as the sound drew closer. The crunch of snow, the shift of weight on stone. Then it stopped, just beyond the threshold. The air in the cave grew tight, the fires crackled, the only sound between them. Whoever was out there did not enter. The steps lingered, then slowly faded back into the storm. He glanced at her, but her expression revealed nothing. Only the faint tightening of her hands on her lap told him she had heard more than footsteps. She knew something he didn't. When morning came, the tracks were already buried by new snow, erased as if no one had been there. Yet the tension remained heavier than before. He wanted to ask who or what had come in the night, but she gave no opening. She moved through the morning as always, steady and precise, her silence thicker than the smoke that curled from the fire. The conflict inside him deepened. He had come to the cave seeking shelter from the storm, but now he was caught in something far larger, something that had nothing to do with weather or wolves. This woman, this cave, the letters, the footsteps, all of it formed a puzzle he was not meant to solve, yet could not ignore. He began to feel that his presence was no accident. The mountain had not simply pushed him here. Something had drawn him, tied him to a story already in motion, one that carried more danger than the storm he had feared. And though the widow spoke little, her silence told him enough. Whatever lived in this cave was not finished with him yet. The snow might clear, the paths might open, but leaving would not be so simple. The mountain held him now, bound by mystery and by a woman whose eyes carried truths too heavy to name. And as the fire burned low that night, he knew the conflict ahead would not be between him and the storm, but between him and the shadows she carried within these stone walls. The cave had begun to feel like a place where time bent against itself. Days blurred into nights, and nights bled into mornings without clear separation. The storm outside finally eased, but snow still lay in heavy blankets across the ridges, making the paths treacherous and deep. The lumberjack knew he could force his way out if he chose, but something rooted him inside those stone walls. It wasn't only the danger of the drifts, it was her. It was a widow, with her silence and her guarded eyes, kept him bound as surely as the mountain itself. Yet the longer he stayed, the more he sensed a shadow that belonged neither to him nor to her. It pressed in at the edges of the cave, unseen but present. The footsteps from that night lingered in his memory like a bruise. Whoever had been outside had not revealed themselves, and she had not spoken a word about it. That silence grew heavier each day, until it seemed almost to choke the air between them. He tried to distract himself with work. He cut wood from the branches he dragged in from the gorge, sharpened his axe, carried snow into the pot to melt for water. These were tasks he understood, the rhythm of survival he had lived for years. But in this cave, each simple act felt like preparation for something larger, something waiting. The widow remained the same. She rose early, tended the fire, moved with quiet precision. Yet he caught her watching the entrance more often, her eyes flicking toward it as though she expected the silence outside to break. Once, when the wolves howled far off in the valley, he saw her clutch the locket at her collar so tightly her knuckles whitened. She thought he did not notice, but he did. Every small movement revealed another layer of the storm inside her. At night, sleep became difficult. The cave no longer felt like a shield. Shadows shifted to easily, and the air seemed to hum with something unsaid. He woke often, his hand wrapped tight around the handle of his axe, his ears straining for the crunch of snow that might return. But the nights remained quiet, almost too quiet. On the fourth evening, as the fire burned low, he finally broke the silence. "There was someone outside that night," he said. His voice sounded louder than he meant it to, bouncing against the cave walls. Her eyes rose from the flames and met his. For a moment, he thought she would deny it. Instead, she only said, "Yes." The word fell between them like a stone dropped into a still pond. It rippled through him, stirring every suspicion he had buried. He waited for more, but she gave nothing. "Who was it?" He pressed. Her gaze did not waver. "It's not someone you need to know." That answer struck him harder than he expected. It told him that she had chosen to face whatever danger lurked in the snow alone, that she had been living in its shadow long before he arrived, and it told him that his presence had changed nothing. He was not part of her story, not truly. He was only a passerby caught in its edges. But that night, as the wind rose again, he heard something new. Not footsteps. Voices, faint, distant, carried by the storm. He sat up, his breath sharp, straining to listen. The tones were rough, male, though he could not make out the words. His chest tightened as he turned toward her. She was already awake, her eyes on him, her expression carved in stone. "They won't come tonight," she said softly, as though she had measured their patience before. "But they will come." He stared at her, his mind turning fast. Men. Not wolves. Not wanderers, lost in the snow. The men who knew this cave, who lingered near it, who waited for something. Isaac suddenly felt too small against the weight of it. The next day was restless. He went to the gorge, breaking branches for firewood, his breath steaming in the cold. Each crack of wood echoed too loudly in his ears. He looked over his shoulder often, certain he would see someone moving through the trees, watching. But the forest stood silent, smothered in snow. Still, the unease did not leave him. When he returned, she was standing at the mouth of the cave, her figure outlined against the snow-bright sky. She held herself tall, her hair blown back by the wind, her eyes scanning the white horizon as if reading signs invisible to him. When she saw him approach, she stepped back inside without a word. That night, as the fire glowed red, he finally asked the question that had been tearing at him since the first moment he saw her. "Why this cave? Why stay here?" For a long time, she did not answer. The fire cracked, sending sparks dancing into the air. At last, she lifted her chin, her eyes catching the glow. "Because this is where he said he'd return." The words hit him with the weight of stone. He thought of the letters bound in string, the carvings on the wall, the locket she clutched in the dark. All of it suddenly bound together in his mind. She wasn't only hiding, she was waiting. But waiting for who? For what? And if the voices in the snow belonged to men who meant harm, why linger still? The questions burned in him, but he did not press further. The answer she had given was already more than he had expected. The tension grew unbearable over the next 2 nights. The voices outside returned, closer each time. Once, he thought he saw a flicker of lantern light moving through the trees below the gorge, faint but deliberate. He did not sleep at all after that, his axe lying across his knees as he sat in the fire's glow. The widow sat across from him, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the cave mouth. She looked not afraid, but resolved. He wanted to ask if she knew them, if they were tied to the letters, if they were the reason she refused to leave. But her silence was an answer of its own. She knew them, and she expected them. By the 6th morning, the snow had hardened under a crust of ice, and the sky cleared to a piercing blue. It should have been a day of relief, the beginning of his path out of the mountains, yet he felt no relief at all. The storm had passed, but something far more dangerous was closing in. He took a step outside, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The air was sharp, the trees gleaming with frost. From the ridge above, he thought he saw a figure move between the pines. Not a trick of the light, not the sway of branches. A man, tall, bundled in furs, standing just long enough to be seen before vanishing into the timber. His grip on the axe tightened. He turned back to the cave, his breath rough in his chest. She was there in the shadows watching him, her face unreadable. "They've found us," he said. She did not flinch. They already had. The words sent a chill deeper than the cold ever could. He understood then that he was no longer just a traveler caught in the storm. He had stepped into a struggle that belonged to her, one that had been waiting long before he arrived. And now, whatever was coming down from the ridge would demand a reckoning neither of them could avoid. The sun slid behind the peaks, and the long shadows stretched across the snow. The forest grew silent, too silent, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. Inside the cave, the fire burned low, and the widow sat close to it, her locket glinting in the last light.
Oh.
The lumberjack stood near the entrance, his axe in hand, his breath steadying for what he knew was near. The night was waiting, and with it the men whose voices had haunted the snow. The night pressed in heavy. For a long while, the only sound inside the cave was the crackle of the fire and the low, measured breath of the man standing watch. The widow had not moved, her back straight as she sat near the flames. Her face steady, though her hands stayed clasped around the locket as if anchoring herself. Outside, the forest was still, the kind of stillness that comes before something inevitable. The lumberjack knew they were no longer waiting for the storm, but for men. He could feel it in his bones. The silence broke with the crunch of snow. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. He stepped closer to the cave mouth, his axe tight in his hand. Shadows shifted among the pines, and then figures appeared. 3 men moving down the ridge, their bodies dark against the pale snow. Each carried themselves with the weight of men who belonged in the wild, hunters or drifters hardened by the land.
Out.
The widow rose quietly to her feet, her eyes locked on them long before they drew near. When the men reached the entrance, they stopped just outside, the firelight casting their faces into half-shadows. The one in front was broad, his beard thick with frost, his eyes sharp with recognition. He looked past the lumberjack and fixed his gaze on the woman. "You're still here," he said, his voice low but edged with certainty. The widow did not move, did not speak, but the way her body stiffened told the lumberjack everything. These were no strangers, were tied to her, bound to the story she had carried in silence all these nights. The man stepped closer, his boots grinding on stone. "We gave you time, more than you deserved. But waiting's done." The lumberjack shifted forward, planting himself between the men and the widow. His presence was enough to make them pause, though he felt the weight of their eyes measuring him, calculating. He had stood against storms, against falling trees and wild beasts. But the tension here was sharper, heavier, built on something more than survival. The widow's voice came then, quiet but steady. "This is my place. I will not leave it." Her words struck hard in the still air, and for the first time the lumberjack began to piece it together. The cave was more than shelter. It was a promise, a place tied to someone who had vowed to return, someone who had never come back. The men outside were bound to that same past, but in a way that carried no hope, only claim. The bearded man sneered, his eyes flicking to the lumberjack. "And who's this? Another fool passing through? You think you can protect her from what's already hers?" The lumberjack felt the widow's eyes on him, but kept his gaze forward. He did not answer, because words would not change anything now. What mattered was the line he had drawn by standing there. The standoff stretched, the air heavy, until finally the men stepped back, their faces cold with promise. "The snow's cleared. We'll return when the night's darker. Think on that." They vanished into the trees as quickly as they had come, their shapes swallowed by shadow. The forest fell silent once more, but the silence now was filled with threat. The widow sank back to the fire, her hands trembling for the first time. The lumberjack lowered his axe but did not put it down. He knew they would return, and when they did, there would be no more words. The hours crawled by. The widow finally spoke, her voice barely above the hiss of the fire. They were kin to him, the man I waited for. When he did not return, they said he would never come, but I could not leave. This place was all I had left of him. Her words carried sorrow, but also defiance. She had lived in that cave not just out of grief, but out of loyalty. The lumberjack understood now why she had clung to the locket, why she kept the carvings and the letters. She had built her life around the promise that someday the man she loved would walk back through that entrance. Yet instead it was his kin who came, and they wanted what was left. The lumberjack felt the truth settled deep in him. He had not come here by chance. The storm had driven him, but it had placed him in the middle of her fight, a fight she had carried alone for too long. He did not say anything, but the way he set his shoulders and stayed by the cave mouth told her enough. When the men returned, it was past midnight. Their lanterns flickered through the trees, their steps steady and unhurried, the confidence of men who believed the land belonged to them. This time they came inside, the fire casting their shadows tall against the walls. The widow stood, her eyes unblinking, her voice calm. "This is not yours. It was never yours." The leader's face hardened. "Then it ends here." What followed was a blur of movement, the clash of will against will. The lumberjack's axe met their advance, the cave filling with the sound of steel on stone, of grunts and shouts that echoed off the walls. The widow did not cower. She moved quickly, throwing wood from the fire, smoke filling the narrow space, blinding and choking those who stepped too close. The struggle was fierce, the cave itself shaking with its weight, till finally the men staggered back, their faces burned with anger, but their bodies beaten by the resistance they had not expected. They retreated, not in surrender, but with the promise of return. Their footsteps faded into the night, leaving only the widow and the lumberjack. The fire still burning, though smaller now, its embers glowing red. For a long time neither spoke. They stood together in the quiet aftermath, the weight of what had passed heavy on their shoulders. At last the widow lowered her gaze, her voice soft. "I thought I could carry this alone. I thought waiting was strength. But maybe I was wrong." The lumberjack placed his axe aside, his hand rough and steady as he rested it on the stone wall. "You've carried more than most could bear. But you don't have to anymore." Her eyes lifted, and in them he saw not the defiance that had kept her alive, but the first glimmer of release. The cave had been her home, her memory, her burden. But now it had become something more, a place where another had stood with her, where she no longer fought the silence alone. When the dawn broke, light spilling across the snow outside, the widow stepped to the entrance. She held the locket in her hand, her fingers loosening at last. She placed it gently on a stone ledge near the fire, leaving it behind not in surrender, but in peace. The promise she had clung to for so long no longer chained her. It had been honored in its own way. The lumberjack watched as she turned to him, her eyes clear. "It's time to leave this place." Together they stepped out into the cold morning, snow crunching beneath their boots, the forest alive with quiet after the storm. The mountain no longer felt like a prison, but like a passage. The widow left the cave that had once been her world, and the lumberjack walked beside her, no longer a stranger passing through, but part of the story she carried forward. The cave remained behind them, its fire burned down to ash, its carvings still etched in the stone, its silence holding the memory of all it had sheltered, but it no longer held her. She had faced what haunted it, and in doing so, she had found freedom. As they made their way down the ridge, the sun rose higher, its light cutting through the cold air. The wilderness stretched wide before them, untamed and uncertain, but no longer faced alone. The lumberjack felt the weight of his axe, the ache of his body, and the quiet strength of the woman at his side. The mountains had tested them, but they had endured. And though the future lay unknown, the lesson of the cave remained clear. Shelter is not only found in stone walls or roaring fires. Sometimes it is found in the strength of another, in the quiet decision to stand together when the storm comes. That was the truth they carried down the mountain. Truth born from hardship, but stronger than the snow, stronger than the silence. The story ended not in the cave, but in the step forward, into the wide and waiting world.